In our last lesson, we learned about Great Britain's three-part plan of attack during the War of 1812. The first part of this three-part plan was to attack from Canada and move into New York. Second, attack cities on the coast, including Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. And third, take control of New Orleans and the Mississippi River. During the War of 1812, the United States benefited from its knowledge about waterways in the U.S. They were able to maneuver around the British blockades and still get supplies through by using these waterways. In the early part of the War of 1812, there were some victories for the U.S. and some for the British. Napoleon was defeated and the war against France came to an end. Britain could now use its full military force against the United States. Today, we will be learning about the attack on Washington, D.C. But first, we'll go over our vocabulary words. Canvas. Canvas is a special piece of material on which artists paint. The artist spent hours painting the canvas. Delicate. Delicate means easily broken or damaged. The teacup is very delicate, so handle it carefully. Perched. Perched means sat on top of something, especially on a place from which it is easy to fall. The bird was perched on one of the highest branches in the tree. Quench. Quench means to put something out or to lessen or reduce it. The runner drank water after the race to quench her thirst. Some other things that could be used to quench your thirst could be a glass of orange juice, a glass of milk, a cup of lemonade, a popsicle, or an ice cube. Things like a hamburger, a banana, peanut butter, or spaghetti would not quench your thirst. After they helped Grandfather Lafitte get fresh water for his horses, JP and Adele led them out into the pasture. Then the children hurried back to the barn and perched themselves on some bales of hay while Grandfather oiled his favorite saddle. "Now are you going to tell us about what happened next?" asked Adele as she climbed up even higher on the hay bales. "I sure am," Grandfather responded. If you remember, the British had a three-part plan. Well, attacking Washington, D.C. was the next part of that plan. The British believed that capturing the capital city would make the United States think hard about surrendering. They put their plan into action in the summer of 1814. They sent an army of about 4,000 men to the capital. Remember, the entire U.S. Army was only that big. The British Army was ready to fight. Washington, D.C. was still a new town at that time. The streets were not paved, and lots of building was taking place. But the U.S. Congress met there to make laws. The Supreme Court met there, and of course, the President and his wife lived there. The U.S. Congress includes two houses that make up the government of the United States: the House of Representatives and the Senate. The Supreme Court is the highest court. Its job is to understand and interpret the laws of this country. Now we know from records that August 1814 was especially hot. The people of Washington, D.C. were struggling to cope with the heat when they heard that the British had landed an army near the city. At the time, there were about 8,000 people living in the new capital. So if the army was 4,000 and only 8,000 people lived there, that is a huge force. "What did the president do?" asked JP as he chewed on a piece of hay. The president knew that he had to be with his soldiers as they faced the British Army. He told Mrs. Madison to stay in the president's house. He asked some soldiers to stay with her and to keep her safe. Then he rode off to be with his army. "Where did he go?" asked Adele. There was a battle fought in Maryland, just a few miles from the city. The British beat the U.S. Army pretty quickly, and then marched on to Washington, D.C. Many of the people in the city left when they heard that their army had been defeated and that the British were on their way. The dirt roads were jammed with people trying to escape, as well as carts piled high with their possessions. "I think I would have been scared," said Adele. "Yes, Adele, war can be scary," reassured Grandfather Lafitte. "We are proud of those soldiers who fought to protect our country back then, just as we are proud of those in the military today who work hard to keep us safe." "What happened to Mrs. Madison?" JP asked, now with a barn cat sprawled across his lap. "Excellent question," replied Grandfather Lafitte. "Mrs. Madison had waited to see what would happen. When she realized that the British were on their way, she got ready to leave. She wanted to try to save some of her things, but she did not know what to bring with her. The president's house contained so many beautiful and valuable items, but she knew she could not take everything. In the end, Dolly Madison saved important papers and letters that she knew her husband would want. At the last minute, a painting of George Washington was also saved. With the British Army so close, they did not have time to carefully remove the canvas from the frame. Instead, the painting and the frame were taken off of the wall. Dolly Madison and others in the president's house made it out of the house just in the nick of time. And George Washington was saved. "What happened when the British soldiers got there?" asked JP as he petted his new friend, the barn cat. This is the famous painting of George Washington that Dolly Madison saved that day. It still hangs in the White House today. The British broke down the doors and rushed inside. It seems Mrs. Madison had set the table for Mr. Madison and his men. Some of the British soldiers later described finding a large table in the dining room set for 40 guests. They described the crystal glasses, shimmering silverware, and delicate china. In the kitchen, meat had been roasting on the fire, and pots and pans had been placed upon the grate. It was clear that the residents of the house had left in a hurry. Some of the British soldiers sat down at the dinner table and enjoyed a tasty meal. For some of these men, it was the first home-cooked meal they'd eaten in quite some time. When they were done, they ransacked the house. Ransacked means to have looked for something in a way that caused disorder or made a mess. They stole anything they could carry away, and then, before they left, they set fire to the president's house. As the flames burned around them, the British marched out of the city. "Was everything ruined?" asked Adele from atop the bales of hay. "Many buildings were," explained Grandfather Lafitte. "When the British Army reached the capital, they destroyed all of the public buildings. Many of them had just been built. The President's house, the Senate house, as well as an important dockyard area, storehouses, and much more. This is a picture of the Capitol building after it was burned." As luck would have it, rain clouds gathered and a big storm moved in. The rain and wind helped to quench the flames. Several days later, when the Madisons returned, they found their home still standing, but it had been very badly damaged. The fire had blackened the walls, many of the windows were broken, and most of their possessions were gone. They were very sad. "That is sad," said Adele as she peered down at her grandfather. "Well, my next story will cheer you up," said Grandfather Lafitte joyfully. "The British got more than they bargained for when they tried to do the same thing in Baltimore."
All right, my friends, let's get into our questions for today's Read Aloud. My first question is, why did the British want to attack Washington, D.C.? Right, the British thought that the Americans might consider surrendering if they attacked the capital. What did James Madison do when he heard that the British were on their way? He left the president's house and went to be with the army. What did the British do when they reached the capital? Right, they destroyed all of the public buildings. Why did they burn the president's house? Right, because it was his house, they thought that he was in there. And even if he wasn't in there, they knew that there were a lot of important papers and documents in there. What did Dolly Madison and the others in the president's house choose to save? Right, Dolly Madison jumped to save all of those important letters and papers. Why do you think that they chose to save the portrait of George Washington? I think it might have been because George Washington was very important to the country, especially at that time. He had been our very first president, and I think that Dolly Madison knew that he would be remembered years and years later, and that that portrait would become important or valuable over time. All right, I want you to turn to your neighbor or parent or whoever is helping you today, and I want you to ask them a question about our read aloud today. Sometimes when we ask someone else a question about something that we learned about, it helps us remember as well. I want you to see if you can think of a question that starts with the word what today. Turn to whoever is with you today and ask them a question about what we learned that starts with what. If they can't answer, then you get to be the teacher for a little while and you get to explain what the answer is. When you are done with that, we'll move on to our next part, to our assignment. Go ahead and pull up the PDF that's attached to this assignment, and I'll jump onto my computer and show you what we're going to do.
Okay, go ahead and get that PDF that's attached to this assignment open. You will need that open while the video is playing. On this very first page, we're going to do an activity where we put things in the correct sequence or order that they happened. You'll notice on this page that there is a thick line here that separates the first 4 sentences from the last 4 sentences. We're going to sequence these in groups of 4. So we'll take these first 4 events that we read about and put them in the correct order that they happened in. To do this, instead of writing 1, 2, 3, and 4, we're going to write first, next, then, and last. First, next, then, and last. All right, our first 4 things that happened were sentence number 1. James Madison asked some soldiers to stay with Mrs. Madison and to keep her safe. Number 2 says, the British Army of about 4,000 men was on its way to the capital. Number 3 says, James Madison rode off to be with his army. And number 4 says, James Madison told Mrs. Madison to stay in the president's house. Which of those things happened first? The first of those things that happened was that the British Army of about 4,000 men was on its way to the capital. That happened first. Your job is to decide what happened second, what happened next, what happened then, and what happened last. Go ahead and pause this video until you are ready to do the same thing with the next 4 sentences. All right, now that we're ready for the next 4 sentences, again, we'll put them in the correct sequence or order that they happened using first, next, then, and last. Our sentences on this section are 1. The British soldiers set fire to the president's house. 2. Dolly Madison escaped just in the nick of time. 3. Some of the British soldiers sat down at the dinner table and enjoyed a tasty meal. And 4. A painting of George Washington was removed from the president's house. Which of these things happened first, next, then, and last? Again, go ahead and pause this video while you're working on that. Pause until you are ready for our next assignment today. Our next assignment today is another portrait for our portrait gallery that we're working on. The person that we will be drawing a portrait of today is Dolly Madison. We'll put her name on that first line. I have included on the set of pages, the next 2 are a letter explaining what we'll be learning about over the next week or so. At the very bottom, there is a professionally painted portrait of our First Lady, Mrs. Dolly Madison. You can use this to help you draw your own portrait of Dolly. Underneath the portrait, on those lines under her name, we'll write some information or important facts about Dolly Madison. Some things that you could include on those lines are: who was she married to? What was she known for? Was she known for being shy, or was she known for being very outgoing and friendly? What did she save? From the president's house. Remember when it started burning, when the British set fire to it, or before the British set fire to it? She saved a couple of things from the president's house. What did she save? I want you to write 2 or 3 sentences about Miss Dolly Madison. When you are finished with your sentences, go ahead and turn this one in today. And that is the end of your assignment for knowledge for today.